Kainatis, hello, and this is Kainati Chai. And I want to have a note in the beginning that this will be in English, but later on we will have, not later on, but I think you should be able to see down below subtitles in both English and Urdu. And of course, then you can actually get in any other language as well. So, first of all, I have to say that it is an absolute pleasure and honor to introduce our guest, Andrian. She is, and I'm going to sort of give a brief introduction, but those who know me or they follow the channel know a little bit of the story of how I got interested in astronomy, and that had to do with Cosmos, the original one in 1984 when it was shown in Pakistan. And a lot of that I have to thank our guest as well, because she was the co-writer and co-producer of Cosmos with her late husband, Carl Sagan. So, Andrian, welcome.
I'm so great. I'm so happy to be with you, son. And especially because we've had a relationship communicating, only once or twice in person, but over the years, communicating electronically for something like almost 20 years. So it's wonderful to be with you.
Right, and so I'm just glad, that we had a chance to actually talk in there. So let me add a little bit more. I mean, I just mentioned that you were co-writer and co-producer of the original Cosmos, but I should also add a few more things. First of all,
Thank you.
you won an Emmy award, your Peabody Award again for the original Cosmos, an Emmy for the sequel as well, which was in 2014 with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then the next one, the third part with the Other Worlds. And so you've been the co-producer of that. You've directed episodes for that. You have, among other things, you have written novels. You have also co-written several non-fiction books as well. And you are the co-founder and CEO of Cosmos Studios that produces science-based entertainment for all media. And in a very small way, by the way, we also produce it through Kainat Studios, these videos. And Kainat actually is a literal translation in Urdu of Cosmos. So there is a copyright infringement, but it's in Urdu, so I think it should be okay.
It is okay. It is okay because in this particular instance, not all, but in this instance, I find it very gratifying.
Thank you very much. So let me start by asking you, because you are such an inspiration to people who do science, and especially women in science, of your role in propagating science in there. How did you yourself got interested in it, and your journey towards sort of like interest in astronomy as well?
Well, I had many spiritual experiences when I was a young person, learning for the first time some mathematics and some science. But I became alienated very, very soon after, not only because my questions were squelched, but also because the way science and mathematics were taught, it felt as if they had been completely denuded of their power, of their mythic narrative power. And as a student who was more at home in history and civilization and pre civilization, I was really struck by how all of our ancestors, beginning not too long ago in a sense, or ending not too long ago in a sense, but going back to the dawn of our communications with each other, that anyone, any shaman, anyone who discovered something about nature, some new tool for understanding our circumstances, that suddenly that communication between the people who studied nature and the rest of us had been completely broken off. I was fascinated as a young student by the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Ionian Greeks, the merchants, and first scientists who began to explain nature without resorting to an unknowable supernatural force to explain everything. And to me, that was one of the greatest revolutions in all of human history, because it meant that instead of, staggering around in the darkness as we have this, this metaphor that Carl and I used in Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, of the orphan left on the doorstep with no note to explain its parentage, its origins, how this miraculous and amazing world came to be. And I was struck by how this community of science had ceased to feel any kind of responsibility to translate its discoveries about nature for the rest of us. And it was remarkably fortunate, a great blessing from chance, that my path crossed with Carl Sagan's, because we both had this yearning to share what science was discovering, what the community of science, the generations of science were discovering about nature. We both had this kind of democratic, small d democratic dream to share this with everyone, because we saw this knowledge as a birthright. And we wanted to restore the narrative power that the ancient creation myths had, which were so satisfying and so beautiful in many ways. And here we actually had some way of testing these ideas, not to discover the absolute truth, not to discover a final understanding of nature, but just these tiny little glimpses of natural reality that could at any time be supplanted and replaced by better ideas. To us, to me, it was a permanent revolution, which really satisfied me. Not like so many social revolutions in human history, which start with an inspiration and degrade substantially over time through laziness, through greed, through so many different human frailties. But here was an error-correcting methodology which would be ceaseless in its sacred searching of nature. And to me, that satisfied my intellectual, spiritual, and emotional quest for a way of seeing that would never become old and stale.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I should mention that I was just checking in that Cosmos has been watched by more than 500 million people on the planet.
Substantially more, yes.
So I
And
think,
it's still being watched
yeah,
42 years after, 42 of the most fertile years of scientific discovery in human history, where there's a fire hose
yeah.
of information and new insights and new understandings. And yet 42 years later, that blend of skepticism and wonder still holds up.
I should mention that on my birthday, where I have sort of freedom to do, and I have a 8-year-old son, and so for the last several years, I think since he's been 5, on my birthday, we actually watch one of the episodes of the original
Ah,
Cosmos. We
oh,
sit together,
wow. What a
and
great
and
custom. I love that.
it's a
Wow.
lot of fun. Yeah.
What does he think of it?
Well, he actually really likes Cosmos because in this household he doesn't have a choice. But but he loves dinosaurs, I have to say. And it's funny. He goes well, astronomy is your thing. My thing is dinosaurs. Even though I tell him
For
sort of
him.
that sometimes these things connect, and especially about the
Yes,
dinosaur
I
extinction.
really do. Yes.
But yeah, but it's funny. He goes well, I'm interested in dinosaurs. Astronomy is your thing, so let me go and read about dinosaurs. So I'm like,
He's
that's fine. That's totally
That's really,
good.
he's fulfilling his biological destiny to differentiate himself from you, but in a very loving way.
That's right. That's right. So can I? And by the way, something that you mentioned, which is really crucial, that in some sense, it's not science. Sometimes the criticism of it comes down to that, well, it takes away beauty, it takes away wonder. And one of the things that you mentioned, and which comes out in Cosmos and in your writing as well, is about the notion of wonder, that it's not discarding of wonder, but it's about that actually what science is finding is actually enriches it. So I think it's sort of like, it that's one of the reasons why I think uh, Cosmos actually resonates, because of that piece of wonder.
Well, to me, and I'm not a scientist, I had a wonderful 20-year tutorial from one of the greatest science teachers in the history of the world. But I have vast areas of ignorance because I am not formally trained as a scientist. Um, but I feel so strongly that there's a analogy to what, to me, the deepest form of love is. And that is not imposing your fantasy on another person,
Yeah.
but adoring them so profoundly that you want to know them as they really are. And you want to go deeper and deeper into that knowledge as you spend more time with them, not deluded, not confirmed in your delusions, but knowing because you trust that the other is capable of bearing that nakedness, that knowing. And to me, that's why I find that science is to me the highest form of loving nature, because it's saying, I don't want to impose my delusions of centrality in the cosmos, and that I'm the crown of creation and the measure of all things. I want to know nature as it really is, because I know it's more wonderful than even I can imagine. And so for me, it's the rigorous, relentless aspect of science that distills a kind of wonder that is earned. It's not just simply the wonder of an empty high of intoxication, but the wonder of really knowing something as deeply as us, very young, very ignorant, very new to these questions, humans are. And so accepting our ignorance, accepting how little we know, to find even these little intimations about how the universe came to be and what happened before we got here. We just got here. And so much of our past is a blank to us, the orphan's mystery of its past. And here we found this phenomenally effective way to discern what happened before we got here. That's a mythic achievement to be able to say with confidence, oh, the continents, were like this 500 million years ago. And there was, that's a degree of knowledge, of reconstructing our past that no other discipline I know of can give us.
Right. So, I mean, this is beautiful. I mean, like, the way you've put it. So, can I ask a question about, you co-wrote original Cosmos with your late husband, and then you have also co-written sort of like the new Cosmos, the sequel in 2014, and of course you co-wrote several books. I'm curious about, in your mind, what sort of like what that process was like, and how is it different, sort of like, writing original Cosmos versus the sequel. And also, is there something that you think it's different, meaning to say in the tone that comes out in the way you write, you wrote before, and the way you write today? Do you see a difference in there, or is it similar? I'm just curious about the process part, like, and how you think the product comes out. I mean, is there something different in your mind, or is it the same?
Well, when we began the original Cosmos uh, with our partner Steve Soter, astrophysicist, wonderful scholar, also as Carl was knowledgeable about so many different things. When we began, um, neither of us had ever worked on a television show before. We had actually developed an idea for what would have been a Cosmos for Kids a couple of
Mm.
years before, and that was the first project that Carl and I ever collaborated on. So we knew that we loved to think together and to write together. And so when we began Cosmos, it was right after our work on the Voyager interstellar message. And it was at the very beginning of our 20 years together. And I must say, the three of us had the most fantastic time because all of a sudden, all of the stories and ideas that had ever inspired us on these subjects, it was possible now to give the fullest possible expression. At that time, we were inventing whole new ways of visualizing history and science. And we were very lucky because it coincided with the birth of something which was then called Magicam, which meant that we could film Carl against what was then a green screen
Ah,
and then create the Library of Alexandria, something I had been dreaming of my whole life ever since I first learned about it from my mother. We could recreate it and make it the size of a ping pong table. And through the magic of these fledgling computers, we could slave a camera to a computer so that wherever Carl walked, he would cast a shadow on this ping pong sized table and give it a kind of verisimilitude that had never been possible before. So it was just a feast of ideas. Carl, as I alluded to earlier, was knowledgeable on every conceivable subject. And there was no such thing as a stupid question, which was part of his astonishing greatness, was that I could just ask him anything I wanted at all hours of the day and night. Could we do this? Or he would suddenly come up with some thrilling idea, or Steve would. And it was a beautiful collaboration because I was the non scientist in this trio, and I could see what we were doing on behalf of our future audience and anticipate the things that were unclear. And to me, the greatness of science is its power of demystification, tearing the veils away from aspects of nature we don't yet understand. And so it just felt, because I came from a, literature and history
mm.
and politics view of things, and then Carl and Steve were so completely knowledgeable about everything, but we're all of the same heart in that we all wanted to share this information with the widest possible global audience. It was 1977 when we began working on it, and we really wanted to deprovincialize, take the imperial aspect away from the perspective and to have a planetary perspective and ultimately a cosmic perspective that we wanted to convey to the audience. And so, when I was doing it with Carl and Steve, there was a sense of security because I felt like I was with two of the smartest people that I've ever known and the most trustworthy in terms of their commitment to be truthful. So that was a romp. We filmed in 60 locations around the planet, and it was just really, I look back on it as, some of the most joyful times of my life. Doing it alone, or doing it, not completely alone because there were 987 people who worked with me on the show, on both seasons of the show, um, and wonderful collaborators. But being at the helm, being a director of these episodes, um, and also being the showrunner who had the final say on every shot, there would be literally on each season, thousands and thousands of VFX, visual effects shots. And I finalized every single one of those shots and was always thinking, how will this how will this reflect on Carl's legacy? How will this reflect on what we achieved together? Does this extend that ethos of skepticism and wonder, or does it in any way diminish it, cut corners on it? That was the huge responsibility. And as you said earlier, the second season of Cosmos, the one that I helmed, was nominated for 14 Emmys, won 4 Emmys, and the Peabody Award. And I think was a global and critical success and an audience success in 181 countries around the world. So what we were so proud of with the original series was the fact that in any culture on Earth, there were people who hungered for the scientific perspective. And here was a kind of affirmation that what we began together in the late 70s was still a really potent form, a genre that, while there had been great science education programs, I could rattle them off for you. Cosmos occupies a unique ecological niche, I think, in that it's really about the ethos of science and that perspective and its potential to move us in our hearts to act in defense of our environment, to protect it, not to sit back because of the examples in history of many, many searchers who were willing to even give up their lives because it mattered what was true. That to me is the height of heroism.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the thing. I mean, again, the wonder component that you have mentioned before, but also the ethos that you are talking about. I mean, I think it's really about science and society. It's not just about teaching about science, but science is not separate from society, but also
Right.
how does this interaction happens, which is really crucial of thinking about those questions. I think that's the difference, that it's not just telling you how do we detect extrasolar planets or things like that, but what does it mean to detect extrasolar planets? Like,
Yes.
along with teaching it. I think that's the
Yes.
connecting.
Exactly. And it's never been more critical than it is right this moment. I know people have a tendency to say these things, but look at how science has had these predictive powers that put to shame all prophecy. Think of how scientists in the 1950s and 60s could predict, with their very limited computing power, they could predict the global mean temperature of today. I know that Pakistan and India, the cities of Pakistan and India that are the 10 hottest cities on Earth right now. And this has caused tremendous suffering that could have been prevented if the scientists like Carl Sagan had been heeded in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Instead, they were ridiculed by publications. There were enormous corporate interests in silencing their predictions about climate change. But just as science can get you to the surface of Mars, and science can take you out to the outer solar system and even into the galaxy and other galaxies, science delivers the goods as nothing else that we humans have ever learned to do. No other ethos that we have adhered to has been able to forewarn us of horrendous dangers. And so now, this dream of cosmos, of an informed global population of this planet, aware, alert, not sleepwalking, not completely blinded by the latest toys and gossip, but really alert and aware. That can only happen with a scientific understanding of what we are facing. And I know that there are reflexes to push this news away, this information away, to deny it, to take refuge in magical thinking. But there's so much at stake. Another thing that science has revealed, that 4 billion year history of life is at stake. Not all of it, but our part in it and so many of the other life forms with whom we share this planet. We, we ignore science, we reject science at our peril, at our danger.
So this is actually a nice connection to my next question, and that is about the future of human space exploration. This is something that, of course, you are interested in. Carl Sagan was also interested in it, and we are in a really important, crucial stage right now because a lot of private companies, for example, are thinking about it. Different nations are also thinking about it. And in some ways, it was not the Apollo missions or not the lunar landing that became the first step. I mean, it was the first step, but there was a discontinuity. And to a certain extent, this decade and the next may really shape what humans are going to do. And of course, one figure whose name comes up quite often, and in some ways, he's representing science in some ways. Again, I'm not sure that whether that's a good thing or not, but that's Elon Musk, right? I mean, his name comes up, and you must have heard about it, that he was on a podcast a couple of years ago when he was reading the excerpt from Pale Blue Dot, and he was on part of it where he read, "The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate." And so this is from Carl Sagan's writing from Pale Blue Dot.
And the next line is something like, visit, yes, but migrate, no, not yet.
That's right, not yet, right? And we have to responsible, and Carl talks about sort of that we have to be responsible. If we do find microbes, then what to do and things like that. So Musk actually stopped at that point and he started laughing. And he says, "Oh, that's not true. That's not true. Of course, Mars. We are going to go to Mars." So I am wondering,
yes,
but he's not talking about visiting, right? So I'm curious because this is such an important time, and in some ways, people like Musk and corporations are also they are going to be playing a big role in space exploration potentially. How do you see the role of private companies in space exploration, and what do you think about colonizing Mars? And of course, it's already a loaded term because we use colonizing, but of course, today we actually understand that it's a loaded term in that sense. So what do you see when you see people like Elon Musk talking about permanent base on Mars or colonizing Mars, or truncating that quote and stopping at that aspect?
Well, I don't find it particularly inspiring. I feel that it's a great leap backwards. That, say what you will about the crimes and misdemeanors of the various superpowers when they were beginning this exploration, it was not about the cheap thrills or the expensive thrills for a lucky few. It was, tainted by empire and all of those sicknesses. But when the pictures of the outer solar system came in from Voyager 1 and 2, they were immediately distributed to the whole world. And there was a sense, even in the days of 1969, nuclear arms race had a terrible, the Soviet Union and the United States had rigged the planet and created a kind of, a global hostage crisis for all of us with 60,000 nuclear weapons on hair triggers. ready to destroy everything that we loved. And of course, the space program is a byproduct of that sickness, of that rivalry. But as hollow as it may have sounded while we were pummeling Vietnam with something like 7 megatons of conventional explosives, the idea was we came in peace for all humankind. And there was something very democratic in a way about it. I remember being at odds with my government, the United States, at the time. But who could resist the pride for our species that we had achieved something as mythic as stepping on our own moon? It was like something out of a magnificent fable or a myth, that a young king decreed that within 10 years we'd walk upon the moon. And 7 years later, we did it. So there was something, it was a moment of human self esteem. I find nothing like that in, taking billionaires to space for brief moments, dirty, dirty launches. The last thing we need. And what are we doing? We are a pale reflection of what we could do 75 years ago and can hardly do now. To me, it is a great leap backwards. Carl always dreamed, and I dreamed with him, that during the most terrifying rivalry between what was then the Soviet Union and the United States until now, what was then the most terrifying rivalry, that somehow all of that testosterone and that desire to prove our valor would be transformed from warfare to the exploration of the solar system and ultimately beyond. That's what we dreamed. But we never, in our worst dreams, imagined that it would be the discretionary income of a handful of people that would determine our future in space. That to me is like going back to the worst days of the 17th and 18th centuries, depending on the patronage of one ego. To me, it has no scientific value. Our understanding of nature is not enhanced in any way. And it's nothing less than a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. Fortunately, there still are governmental space programs that promise, including the recently launched and now focusing Webb Space Telescope, as well as missions to the outer planets and moons to look for life. These are all great things, and I'm glad we're doing them. But I feel like the role of the billionaires is a distraction from the really great science that we could be doing, and it leaves me cold. I just feel a sense of sadness on a planet where everything is for sale to the highest bidder, and when all the joys and thrills of our technical civilization are reserved for a handful of people who in my view, control far too many of our resources. That's sad. That's a leap backwards. And I dream of a time when all of the governments of Earth will outgrow this adolescence, this rivalry, this internecine warfare that is costing all of us so much, and pool their genius, their resources, their talents, their courage to get on with what we really should be doing. To me, this is a tragic little backwater that I hope we will be out of as soon as possible.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, I share that, and it's not that sad. I mean, I find it a little depressing as well because then the same people actually use, like, the narrative of saving the planet or saving the species while doing it for profits and that. And I think it's sort of like, it's misleading, and again as inspirational figures. I mean, again, and people find them as role models and stuff like that. And I think it is becoming. I mean, in some sense, it's capitalism gone amok.
Yes,
That's
yeah, no, it is.
all
It
about
is.
that.
It is. And I want to add that whether it's socialism, capitalism, communism, libertarianism, any of the isms, where is the socioeconomic philosophy which thinks in the timescales of science? Where is that philosophy? I don't care what you believe in, the profit motive, the collective, whatever you believe in. When are we going to start thinking in terms of 1,000 years from now? And because our actions have consequences that long, that deep into the future. The lever arm of our technology has become so much more powerful, and yet we have failed to begin to think in the timescales of the influence that we have. And to me, the one that deposits a significant fraction of the world's resources in the hands of a few people is unlikely to get us to where we need to be.
Right. Well, so last question, and thank you so much for your time. And
My pleasure. You ask great questions.
thank you. Uh, and so I know it's not a fair question because you you were co-producer of that, and you co-wrote that too, the movie Contact. I was going to ask you, okay, so if you were say, okay, and it's it's probably my favorite science fiction film. So I wanted to ask you, other than Contact, so we remove Contact from the equation. What is your favorite science fiction film?
Oh, 2001. It has been since what, 1967, I think. I mean, I guess, I just have never, I remember seeing it for the first time when it first came out in a huge theater, 70 millimeter meditation on human existence that, I can't imagine Warner Brothers being willing to make that again in that way. Because, first of all, to me, it still feels futuristic. Um, it still has the power to transport you. And most of all, the ambiguity of it is the most valuable thing, because I find in most science fiction, I just feel it has a shelf life of 3, 4, 5 years. Some of it is already, when you see it, it's already expired. Excuse me. But to me, 2001 is just a masterpiece of imagination and visualization. And so, I have yet to see a film that rivals it.
And it still looks good. I saw it 2 years, 2019, I think a couple of years ago, they had re-released it on XD. And I went back to see it, and it's just such immersive. It's such crisp. The special effects don't look old. It's
So
really
epic.
wonderful.
It's so
Yeah,
epic. And that one scene, which is so long, of the mothership and
right.
the baby ship. And the baby ship is approaching, and it must be on screen. It feels like for minutes,
It's
but
yeah,
it really gives you a sense of the environment of space,
right.
of what that's like, the grace of it. It's magnificent.
And it matches, the philosophy matches with that sort of like, it's not looking for tiny thing. It's actually asking really big questions.
Big questions.
Well, and thank you so much for your time. I mean, I think audience in Pakistan, India, people who speak Urdu, Hindi, who understand it, they would also benefit it from the subtitles. But it is such a pleasure to talk to you. It's sort of like brings fond memories of watching Cosmos as well.
Ah,
So thank you so much for your time. I really
thank you
appreciate it.
so much. It was wonderful to be with you. I look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Bye bye.